What I was saying is this is a prison that was designed to, as the name suggests, to contain terrorism. The government of El Salvador says that this is the place where they have the worst of the gangs that used to control, terrorize the population for many years. And that the only way that they were able to not only crack down on the crimes, taking El Salvador from being the unsafest place in the world to the safest in this hemisphere, was by cutting out any information, any communication coming in or out of that prison. What this means is they block cell phone signal. These prisoners don't even go out to a yard. It's a place that has multiple layers of security in terms of gates, as you can see in these images, where when you walk into these modules that you can see on those images, kind of looking like airplane hangars, the inmates are in there in cells that have about 80 to 100 of them, and that is where they will spend their lives. There are many, among the 20,000 or so in a prison that has a capacity of 4,000, that are not convicted of crimes yet. But El Salvador has lifted a number of rights under a state of exception, basically declaring war on the gangs that President Bukele did almost years ago. And what that means is you don't get proper due process. People who are suspected, sometimes best based on something as simple as an anonymous tip, are thrown into these prisons. They can wait their years before they have the possibility of representation, of showing up in court. They don't get to talk to attorneys, especially in Secot, outside of the hearings that happen within a room where they have access to Zoom. But attorneys don't show up, family cannot go visit, and they do not connect with the outside world. So in this case, where these Venezuelans, who the US government is alleging are gang members, and in one case of one prisoner whose family I talked to, or deportee whose family I talked to, there's absolutely no record of him having committed any crimes. The family had no idea he was there until CBS News reported yesterday a list detailing or showing the names of those who are there, but have very little hope that they could be brought back. These are not people who were just deported. These are people who were taken to that place where you have any sense of identity stripped out of you, and where the director of the prison and several ministers I interviewed tell me they're going to spend their lives there, and that they are confident that anybody who's there is a gang member. And even though a few thousand people have been able to get out of not that, but other prisons and shown they're innocent, it's a system that imprisons you first, cuts you out from the world. And multiple studies from human rights advocates and organizations there have shown that there are systemic issues with torture and all conditions in these prisons, where it's very hard to prove that you're innocent.
And I've seen from your piece, this is a place where the lights never go off, that you've got every cell which is full, a row of metal bunk beds, you have no sheets, no bedding, 2 sinks, 2 toilets, no windows, nothing else allowed. And you've said, actually seeing that, it's going to take you time still to process what you've witnessed.
Honestly, I walked out of there, and the stripping of somebody's humanity, despite, look, these people, many of them have committed horrific crimes, but it's very hard to be there in person, staring at human beings who are looking out at you, and it feels like a zoo. Like, they don't communicate, they don't express themselves, they don't move, they're just staring. And I asked one of the prison guards, I'm very surprised, in any other prison, they would be hissing or kissing or making any kind of gestures. And they told me if they do that, they will go into solitary for 15 days, which is the highest amount of days that they're allowed legally to put somebody in solitary. And I asked, what's the average for something as simple as making a facial gesture at me right now? And they said, no, everybody goes in there for 15 days. That's just what we do. And that solitary confinement, I was inside that cell. It is absolutely pitch black. There's only a tiny hole in the top where some daylight comes through, a little bit of light, a speck of light. And it's a place where you have absolutely no sound. It's a place that seems to be designed to absolutely make you crazy. And what's interesting about this prison is the fact that they acknowledge that a lot of people there are not convicted of crimes, but it almost doesn't matter. They're convinced that whoever goes there is going to be there for life. They're convinced that it's more important to achieve that safety in the country than this whole thing about human rights, as they say.
And you've got prisoners there outside of solitary confinement, just listening to your piece, 23 and a half hours inside, the other 30 minutes spent in a central corridor for exercise ad infinitum. And then you have, let's take a look, in fact. This is a conversation that you had with one of those inside.
How do you feel right now?
Got to recognize that what happened to us is like that Titanic, that we were big and strong gang, but we got hit with the iceberg.
Are you going to be here the rest of your life?
Yeah, the rest of my life. We murdered a lot of people, and this is the consequence of what we did one day.
How do you stay sane? How do you keep your head above water?
Like, try to act strong in the day and cry in the nighttime.
You cry at night?
Yeah, because we know that we're not going to get out of here.
So President Bukele came in 2019 and started enacting this 2021, and the people in there saying that, let's make history, and it's about taking people off the streets and the question about whether the ends actually is worth the means to it. And I think I'm right in saying, Lilia, he's got a 90% approval record. So this is someone who's become the populist poster boy for law and order that's attracted Donald Trump.
Absolutely. And look, I have been sharing all of this content for a month, and almost 90% of the comments are people celebrating Bukele. Understandably, I interviewed people in El Salvador who said we were kidnapped. And I've interviewed many migrants who used to come from El Salvador to the United States at the border who were fleeing persecution, mutilations, kidnappings, extortion. Anybody who had a business would be extorted. I mean, this place is now a place where you used to see heads in the middle of a park, and now you can walk around and take your family there. So it is a very effective system that has overwhelming support. In the case of Bukele, this is a country where there was all of that consensus. These gangs really did terrorize the population. In the case of the U.S., there has been this narrative about the dangerous Tren de Aragua, which is an organized crime group, which does terrorize people, who does smuggle people. But when I have interviewed officials from the police in New York, for instance, who talk about Tren de Aragua, and I ask about what are these horrific crimes that they're committing in the U.S.? Are they terrorizing the U.S. population? And now, thinking back, are they terrorizing the population to the point of ending up in those cells with those terrorists from those El Salvador gangs? They've shown me very little evidence that this, and I'm not saying, you have to terrorize the whole country to face that kind of fate, but in dozens of the cases where we are at CBS News talking to attorneys and reading their records or hearing from attorneys and seeing their filings where they're saying these people don't have any evidence of crimes. That's how they do it in El Salvador. And one thing is to deport people following a due process with a court order that denies asylum. Another thing is, not allowing that to happen and invoking this law that gives full power to just deport people. And a far worse thing is to deport people without enough evidence of crimes, just saying that they have tattoos, which, by the way, Tren de Aragua is unlike the MS-13, where they're not pointing at tattoos that say Tren de Aragua. They're pointing at random tattoos like a nautical star or a rose, and then sending them there.
Which takes us to a point, actually, like you say, with the 18th Street as well, you can see the 1-8, 18, on the back. I think human rights organisations have said something like 10 to 15% of those inside are likely to be innocent. And you found a family who say that their loved one who'd moved from Venezuela, I think he was a barber, he had a tattoo. Yeah. And let's have a listen to the conversation that you had. This is the wife of Franco Caraballo.
Why did he think that they were going to deport him for the tattoos?
Por el reloj.
Because of a clock.
El reloj tiene la fecha de nacimiento de su primera hija.
A clock that marks the time when your daughter was born.
His wife, Johanny, says she last spoke to her husband the day before he was deported.
What worries you about him being in this prison?
Que me preocupa de que él es inocente.
That he's innocent.
Y el maltrato que está recibiendo allá adentro.
And you think he's being mistreated in there?
Exactamente.
What do you think is in it, Lilia, for President Bukele? Is it this sign that he is the go-to, he is the solution for security, and he's got the ultimate accolade, which is President Trump?
Absolutely. I interviewed the Minister of Security and I interviewed the Minister of Defense in El Salvador. And I asked them, how sustainable is this model? Look, it's not very expensive compared to how expensive it is to detain people in the U.S. All that President Trump has given so far, or the Trump administration has given so far to the Bukele administration to take these deportees is something like $6 million, which Bukele himself has said it's a very small fee. But he's offering two things. He's offering a method with which people would be completely frightened to try to go to the U.S., and that's what the U.S. wants, or several things. He's also offered a cheaper way to deal with these gangs and to promote his brand. And I think the main goal of the Trump administration at this point was to reduce migration to the U.S., and it has done that, not only by taking away many of the ways that people used to ask for asylum or parole or visas, but by scaring people in this way. I think Bukele knows exactly what he has done in terms of the marketing or the promotion of his brand as this tough on crime person. So it helps him in that way. And it also helps the U.S. deal with the issue of immigration, which most experts say, and most polls show actually, that is what got President Trump elected.
Lilia, brilliant to talk to you. Really great to have your insight, a rare insight in terms of what's going on, a very important context. Lilia Luciano, CBS correspondent and anchor, and also founder of the El Flow podcast. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you.